Hello everyone, thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoy it and feel relaxed. Before we begin, I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe and like the video to support my efforts. I'm currently a high school history teacher, and this is something that happened a few years ago. It was a normal school day. I had just finished teaching a class, and we were heading into the third period for the day. During this hour, I didn't have a class. Each teacher in the department would get a free period where they didn't have a class. Usually, I used this hour to grade assignments and prepare lessons. On this day, when the previous class ended and the next period started, I left my classroom. I was headed to the teacher's lounge to make some coffee before returning to my room. Each department had its own lounge, and in the history department, there were 5 of us. When I arrived at the lounge, it was empty. The lounge was just a little ways down the hall, located between 2 hallways. It was a strange room because it had 2 windows that looked out into the hallways. We always kept the curtains closed so nobody could see inside. I never understood why there were windows there in the first place, but that's just how it was. Inside the lounge, there were a few couches, a table, some chairs, a fridge, and a TV. It was basically a break room. The floors were carpeted, and it was quite comfortable. I took my time making coffee since I didn't have much work to do. As I was standing there, I suddenly heard over the school speakers that we were going into lockdown. I was surprised. In all my years as a teacher, I had never experienced a real lockdown, only drills. I wondered what the reason could be. Up until that point, it had been a completely normal school day. I decided to go to the doorway to see if there were any students in the hall. If there were, I would help them get to a classroom. When I opened the door and looked into the hallway, it was empty and eerily quiet. I went back into the lounge, grabbed my coffee, and was about to head back to my classroom. But when I got to the door again, I saw someone in the hallway. It wasn't a student or another teacher. It was a man, younger looking but clearly too old to be a high school student, probably in his mid to late 20s. He was walking in my direction. Something felt off, so I decided to go back inside the teacher's lounge. My instincts were telling me that this person wasn't supposed to be there. After I got back inside, I locked the door. Seconds later, someone tried to open it. It was obviously the guy I had just seen. I was shocked that he would try to come into the lounge. Why would he want to enter the teacher's lounge? Then he knocked on the door. I wasn't sure whether to answer or not. For a moment, I considered it. But then I heard him say, "Let me in a demanding tone. That made me decide against it. I didn't respond and instead took out my phone to call the principal. I wanted to know why we were in lockdown and who this man was. The man outside knew I was inside the room, so I called out, asking him who he was. He didn't answer me, he just demanded again to be let in. I tried calling the principal, but he didn't pick up. He was probably busy with the lockdown situation. I waited a minute and tried again, but there was no answer. During this time, the man outside had stopped knocking, and I hadn't heard anything from him for a while. I hoped that he had left. As I dialed the principal's number again, I suddenly heard the sound of shattering glass. I looked over and saw one of the windows in the break room being broken by a blunt object. The curtains were still closed, so I couldn't see what was on the other side very well. Soon, the entire window was smashed. I stood there in shock as I saw the man from the hallway starting to climb through the broken window, entering the room. As soon as I saw him, I sprinted for the door. I ran out of the lounge and didn't stop until I made it back to my classroom. Once inside, I locked the door behind me without looking back. Luckily, I didn't see the guy following me. I finally felt safe now that I was in my classroom, but I knew the man was still somewhere inside the school. I called the police and was told that they were already aware of the lockdown and that officers were on their way. After that, I didn't see or hear anything else. I waited inside my classroom until the lockdown finally ended about 15 or 20 minutes later. The man was caught by the police. He had snuck into the school and was apparently on drugs. I don't know much more about his intentions, but I'm just really glad I got away from him. This story is from 2017, when I was a freshman in high school, and one day I found myself bored in my third period class. I was looking forward to getting out later because I had an orthodontics appointment to get my braces adjusted, and my mom would be coming to the school to pick me up. The class I was in was math, and to be honest, it was quite boring. I was never a math guy in high school, so I usually just sat in the back corner, zoning out and looking out the window. This classroom was on the second floor, and I found myself staring out into the front parking lot below, waiting for my mom to arrive. As I was daydreaming, I noticed several police cars driving down the street. They ended up pulling into the front school parking lot, which struck me as a little strange. But my attention was soon interrupted when the classroom door opened and a student came in with a pass. I knew it was for me. The teacher paused, took the pass, and called my name. I packed up my things, took the homework assignment from the teacher, and left the classroom, excited to leave school early. As I started walking down the hallway, I got a text from my mom saying she was waiting for me by the side door. That door was on the opposite end of the school, but I didn't mind. I made my way through the empty halls, enjoying the break from class. Then, suddenly, a sound came over the school intercom. Immediately, I had a bad feeling. This was out of the ordinary. The announcement came. The school was going into lockdown. I was still a ways away from the side door, but I really wanted to get there before they locked everything down. I didn't want to get stuck in the school, especially not during a lockdown. Plus, if I made it to my appointment, my mom would let me take the rest of the day off. I sped up my pace, walking faster through the halls. I hadn't seen anyone since I left my classroom, and I was hoping it would stay that way. If a teacher saw me, they would probably make me go into their classroom. As I neared the side doors, I heard footsteps coming from an upcoming hallway that was about to intersect with mine. I didn't have to go down that hall, but whoever was walking would cross paths with me. Not wanting to be seen, I decided to stop and hide behind a set of lockers. The footsteps grew louder and closer. My heart began to race. I waited for the person to pass, but suddenly their footsteps quickened, like they knew I was there. Panic set in. I turned and began walking in the opposite direction, but the footsteps behind me picked up pace. I almost ran to the nearest corner and darted around it, hoping whoever it was would lose interest. But they didn't. I heard the footsteps following me, closer now. I ran down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I thought there was no way they would follow me down, but I was wrong. They were still behind me. At this point, I was sure someone was chasing me. Maybe it was a teacher, but I wasn't certain. I didn't have time to find out. I turned down another hallway, long and straight, hoping to lose them. The only sounds were my own frantic footsteps and theirs steadily closing in. I ran as fast as I could toward the end of the hallway, my breath ragged. Just before I reached the corner, I glanced back, and that's when I saw him. It wasn't a teacher. It was a man with long, stringy black hair, wearing a black leather jacket. I had no idea who he was, but something about him sent chills down my spine. I sprinted toward the side doors, my legs burning as I pushed myself faster than I ever had before. I reached the exit, burst through the doors, and ran straight for my mom's car. I jumped inside and slammed the door behind me, breathless. I told my mom we were in lockdown and that someone had been following me around the school. She immediately called the school to report it. As we drove away, we saw several police cars outside, and I remembered seeing them pull into the parking lot earlier. It had to be connected. Later that day, I found out more about what had happened. The man who had been following me was fleeing from the police. He had led them on a brief chase after his car got stuck in a ditch, and he had fled on foot. He ran for a while and somehow managed to make it onto the school campus. The police were mostly searching the area behind the school, not thinking he had actually gotten inside. But he had. Eventually, the police found him in one of the hallways inside the school. Luckily, no one was harmed. As far as I know, no one realized he had been following me. To this day, I don't know why he chased me or if he was dangerous, but it remains the scariest experience I've ever had in high school. Back in my junior year of high school, I used to get to school about 15 minutes before it started. The bus would drop us off, and after making my way inside, my routine was always the same. I'd head upstairs to my locker first. There was a spot upstairs near the stairwell that had this large window at the end of the hall, not far from my locker. It was the perfect hangout spot for my friends and me. The window overlooked part of the parking lot and the softball field to the east. And every morning we'd gather there, watching the sunrise, lighting up the hallway in a warm, golden glow. It was our little slice of peace before the chaos of the school day began. That particular morning started like any other. I arrived, went to my locker, and joined my friends at the window. There were about 5 of us, talking and laughing, just like we did every day. As the warning bell rang, signaling it was time to head to class, we all began to disperse. The once crowded hallway started to empty, and as I looked out the window, I noticed a few stragglers hurrying into the school, racing against the clock to make it to class. Then, something, or rather, someone caught my eye. I saw a man rushing into the building. He wasn't a student. He was too old for that. But he didn't look like a teacher either. He wore a baggy, worn-out sweatshirt and sweatpants. At first, I assumed he might be a substitute, but he wasn't dressed the part. There was something off about him. I shrugged it off and made my way to class, still wondering who he was. As I walked through the hall, I glanced back toward the stairwell. There he was again. The same guy, now making his way up the stairs to the second floor. A small knot formed in my stomach, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just lost. I entered my classroom, pushing the thought out of my mind. The day carried on like normal. I went through my next couple of classes without incident, but the unsettling feeling from seeing that man lingered. Then came lunch period. As I sat with my friends, chatting at the table, I saw him again. He walked into the lunchroom for a moment, just long enough to be noticed, and then quickly exited through another door. It struck me as strange that I kept noticing him. Our school was large, with hundreds of students, and it was easy to blend into the crowd. But there he was, again and again, just on the periphery of my awareness. As the day went on, I couldn't shake the weird feeling that something wasn't right. By the time my last class rolled around, I had almost forgotten about him, until halfway through when the phone in the classroom rang. My teacher answered, his face becoming serious as he listened to whoever was on the other end. After hanging up, he turned to us, his voice tense. "We're going into lockdown," he said. "Move to the back of the room. Now." We were confused, whispering to each other, trying to figure out what was happening. The teacher quickly locked the door and turned off the lights, but offered no explanation. We huddled together at the back of the room, the tension in the air thick. My mind raced, but strangely, I didn't think about the man I'd seen earlier. Like everyone else, I was clueless, sitting in the darkness, waiting. Time seemed to crawl. After what felt like an eternity, almost an hour, the lockdown was finally lifted. We still had no idea what had happened. As the final bell rang, we filed out of the building, everyone on edge but unsure of why. I rode the bus home, my thoughts still spinning, and when I got home, my mom was waiting for me. She asked me if I'd heard about the lockdown, and that's when I found out the truth. The man, the same one I'd seen multiple times throughout the day, was the reason for it. He had been spotted walking suspiciously down a hallway during the last period, and the school had gone into lockdown. The police had been called, but by the time they arrived, the man had managed to escape through an open window. No one knew who he was or what he had been doing in the school all day. It blew my mind. This stranger had been wandering the halls since the start of the day, and no one had noticed him until the very end. I told my mom about the multiple times I had seen him entering the school, in the lunchroom, by the stairs, and it chilled me to realize how easily he had slipped under the radar. To this day, I still don't know who that man was or what he had been planning. I'm just thankful that he didn't do any harm. But it haunts me, the thought of how close we all came to something potentially dangerous and how easily it could have gone unnoticed. This story takes place years ago when I was in high school. It was after lunch period, on an ordinary day that quickly turned into something I'll never forget. At my school, we had classes, followed by lunch, and then a brief study hall. The study hall was usually in the same classroom we had right before lunch, but for me, that meant gym class. I was in 10th grade PE, and it was always an easy, laid-back time. However, Study hall wasn't always in the gym. If another teacher was using their classroom, we'd sometimes end up sitting on the bleachers doing homework. It wasn't the best arrangement, but it was what it was. On this particular day, after lunch, I started heading back to the classroom for study hall. It was on the other side of the school, a bit of a walk from the lunchroom. I lingered a bit, chatting with some friends, not really in any rush, because my gym teacher was relaxed about being a minute or two late. As the lunchroom emptied, I made my way through the quiet halls. When I reached the classroom, the door was shut, which was strange. I grabbed the handle and tried to open it, but it was locked. The lights were off inside. I stood there for a moment, confused. That's when it hit me. We must be meeting in the gym today. How did everyone else know that except me? I didn't remember being told. Frustrated but resigned, I turned to head back to the gym. Halfway there, the school's speakers crackled to life. This is a lockdown. This is not a drill. Please remain in your classrooms. No students are to be in the halls. My heart stopped for a second. A lockdown? It hadn't registered with me that something serious was happening. Panic gripped me as I realized I was in the middle of an empty hallway, alone. I sped up, hurrying toward the gym, hoping the doors weren't locked too. But when I got there, my fears were confirmed. The doors were closed, locked tight. I stood there frozen, dread creeping in. That's when I realized I should have stayed with the class. I turned and started walking back toward the classroom, this time with a growing sense of urgency. The halls were eerily quiet, nothing but the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty space. But then a loud crash shattered the silence. Something slammed into a locker around the corner. My heart leapt into my throat. I stopped dead in my tracks. It sounded like someone had punched the locker or thrown something against it, and the noise reverberated through the empty school. Fear surged through me. I didn't want to go toward that noise, but I had no choice. Just as I was deciding what to do, I heard footsteps. Someone was coming. Fast. My body went into autopilot. I saw a staircase to my left and darted toward it, sprinting down the steps. When I reached the bottom, I ran about 30 feet down the hallway and reached the first classroom I saw. Desperation kicked in, and I started banging on the door, praying someone would let me in. Nobody answered. I tried the handle. It was locked. Panic clawed at me as I banged harder, but there was still no response. Glancing back, I saw legs coming down the stairs. Whoever was following me was closing in. I didn't want to know who it was. I just kept pounding on the door, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, it opened. The teacher yanked me inside, locking the door behind me. The lights were off, and the students were huddled on the floor at the back of the room. I scrambled over to join them. Barely a second later, whoever had been following me reached the door. The handle jiggled as they tried to get in. Then there was a loud bang, someone hitting the door from the outside. The teacher stood frozen for a moment, then cautiously peered through the small window. Whoever it was must have been right there. But she didn't say anything, just backed away and motioned for us to stay silent. The tension in the room was unbearable, everyone too scared to even breathe. We waited in complete silence, huddled together, listening for any sound outside the door. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the banging stopped. Whoever it was seemed to have gone. We stayed locked down for what seemed like hours, though it was probably just an hour. When the lockdown was finally lifted, I was called to the principal's office to give a statement about what had happened. They never told me who the person was or why they were following me. That day remains the scariest experience I ever had in high school, and I never want to know what might have happened if they had caught up with me. Back when I was in high school, during my freshman and sophomore years, I used to ride the bus. It picked me up early in the morning at the corner of my street and dropped me off after school. I went to an average-sized high school about 10 minutes away from home. At least it felt average. Around 800 students spread across 4 grades. Nothing special. This happened during my sophomore year, on what started as a typical school day. The bell had just rung for the final class of the day. As usual, I was at my locker, talking to my friends. The hallway was packed with students, everyone moving between classes, and the noise was almost deafening. The first warning bell went off. 2 minutes until class. Most kids began hurrying off, but a few of us stayed behind, confident we had enough time. Among the group was Jake, a senior who was hanging out with us because his younger brother, Tommy, was in my friend group. As we lingered, a strange sound echoed through the school speakers. At first, I thought it was the second bell, but something was off. It wasn't the normal chime signaling the start of class. A voice came over the intercom, tense, deliberate. The school is going into lockdown. All students must go to their next class immediately. Teachers, lock your doors and turn off the lights. I remember looking around. The halls weren't as crowded anymore, but a handful of kids, including my friends, were still lingering. One of them muttered, "I'm not sticking around for this." He glanced toward one of the side exits. I saw about 10 kids sprinting for the door, already making a break for it. It was tempting. The lockdown could last hours, and there was only one period left anyway. That's when Jake turned to me and said, "I'm out. Need a ride?" He started walking toward the exit before I even answered. Chaos was breaking out. Half my friends were following Jake, the other half headed to class like we were supposed to. I hesitated, caught between staying and leaving. My mind raced as teachers started shouting for everyone to get to class. But Jake was offering a way out. Without thinking, I sprinted toward the door, ignoring the shouts behind me. By the time I made it outside, kids were running in every direction. Some headed for the parking lot, others were bolting through the grassy field toward the nearby neighborhood. I was supposed to go with Jake, but when I reached the parking lot, I couldn't find him or my friends. The panic around me was growing, kids scattering like ants. I hurried to the other side of the school, hoping Jake had parked somewhere else. But when I got to the far lot, it was empty. I was alone. My heart raced. What now? I couldn't go back inside. The doors were locked, and I wasn't supposed to have left anyway. But I didn't have a way home either. I stood there frozen for a moment, trying to figure out my next move. That's when I saw him. A man came out of the school, glancing over his shoulder. He wasn't a student, he was too old, and definitely not a teacher. Something about him set off alarms in my head. The way he moved, the way he looked around, like he was hiding something. He didn't belong there. And then, just as I realized that, he looked right at me. My blood turned to ice. I ducked behind the nearest tree, holding my breath, praying he hadn't seen me. For a few tense seconds, I stayed there, my heart pounding so loud I swore he could hear it. I peeked out, hoping he was gone. But then I heard his footsteps. They were getting closer. I bolted. The woods were only about 20 feet away, and I didn't stop running until I was deep inside. I crouched behind a fallen log, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My mind was racing. Why was he following me? Who was this guy? The lockdown hadn't seemed serious at first, but now I realized I might be in real danger. I waited, barely breathing, listening for any sign of him. Then I heard it, footsteps in the grass just outside the woods. He was close, too close. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped up and ran, tearing through the underbrush. Branches scratched at my arms, and I stumbled, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. After what felt like an eternity, I burst out of the woods onto a sidewalk that led to the street. My legs were shaking, but I kept running until I reached a gas station down the road. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I went inside and begged the employee to let me use his phone. My hands were trembling as I called my mom, telling her about the lockdown and the man. She came to pick me up in no time, and I've never been more relieved to see her. Later, I found out the man had come to the school trying to pick up his daughter. He didn't have custody, and he was drunk. He had threatened a janitor when they tried to make him leave. That was why the school had gone into lockdown. But I still don't understand why he followed me out into the woods. Maybe he was just confused, or maybe he had something far worse in mind. Either way, I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps behind me, chasing me through the trees.